there were two rules at the very first meeting. The first rule was that Image Comics Incorporated would own nothing except the Image logo and the Image eye. That's it. That's all Image Comics Incorporated is allowed to own. The second one was that no partner would ever interfere with any other partner in terms of their business.
Whatever happened at Image, the best things that happened out of Image, in my mind, came about because of the rivalry between the partners.
And I think they missed an incredible opportunity to shape comics in a really healthy way moving forward. And instead, they became a corrosive force on the art form. But they were younger. They didn't understand.
Lee lured legendary Watchmen writer Alan Moore back to superhero comics to do 1963.
Todd McFarlane is the guy that hires Alan to write Violator.
I had Alan Moore, who hadn't done any comics in several years.
In 2001, on the Comic Book Resources website, Alan had this to say about his time at Image Comics. Well, I'd been away from mainstream comics for quite a while. I've got no idea what the audience is like. And the Image Comics people were very keen for me to work for them. The thing that basically they said, would you like to do some comics for us? I said, yeah, just to see if I can do it.
This is pretty much what happened to me.
So how did Alan Moore actually join Image Comics as one of their most prolific writers?
Jim Valentino was the one that reached out to me first through Larry Marder. Jim Valentino didn't want me, and he didn't want Rick Veitch. And I'm not being cantankerous about saying that or whatever, and I don't mean any ill will at all toward Jim. He was wonderful to work with. Image wanted Alan Moore, and they didn't know how to reach Alan Moore. They knew I had worked with Alan Moore, and they knew that I not only had worked with Alan Moore at DC Comics on Swamp Thing, but they also knew from Taboo that I was working with Alan Moore on a different business level in terms of From Hell and Lost Girls both debuting and being serialized initially in Taboo. So I got a call from Larry Marder saying, Steve, Jim Valentino would like to talk to you about doing a project. And Larry would first talk to you as the company man he was representing, but we were friends. So Larry would then say, okay, I'm putting a different hat on now. And he would say, and he said in this case, what they really want is to work with you and Alan Moore. And I knew what that meant. Alan was the big fish.
All of them had just made buckets of money. So they were like going crazy, buying houses and cars and doing all kinds of stuff. And they were also setting up studios, hiring people. So they were in kind of like berserker mode, which we had just gotten out of with Tundra. But we kind of had to deal with it. We worked with Valentino, who I think out of all the Image guys, his heart was really in the right place in terms of we're doing this for comics, not just for ourselves. And he was just fantastic.
I knew some things that Larry Marder and Jim Valentino at that time didn't know, and one of them was that all of us, Alan, Rick Veitch, myself, were sort of reeling from the implosion that was happening with Tundra. And for Alan Moore, it was compounded further by the implosion of Big Numbers, which was a project that Alan really believed in and had even put his own money into by launching Mad Love as a publishing imprint. Some of that was subsidized by Dave Sim, but a lot of it was the money Alan had been earning from Watchmen and all the amazing work he had done for other comic publishers. And he lost a fortune on Big Numbers. What I knew when Larry called was we all needed a project to work on to get ourselves back up on our feet. First, I called Rick Veitch before I called Alan. I said, Rick, I just got this phone call from Larry Marder. Are you interested in having anything to do with this? And Rick was like, if you can put it together, Steve, and if it looks like it's going to work, let's do it. And then I called Alan. And there were a number of factors. I won't go into too much detail, but Alan was overworked at this time. And Alan was in this horrible vice where he was committed to fulfilling and completing these major works, From Hell, Lost Girls, his first novel, The Voice of Fire, and yet none of them were bringing in sufficient income because they were all works that he owned or co-owned in the case of Lost Girls and From Hell. And he was stretched horribly thin and had a number of family members he was taking care of at the time. We also had a situation where Rick and I were seeing that Tundra was going under and we would need to do something. So knowing Alan's situation, he's overworked, he needs income. When I called him to talk to him about he and Rick and I doing something together, Alan said, I just can't take on one more thing.
I refused to be working upon something that I was not interested in. I didn't want writing to become a drudge like the job that I was leaving to become a writer.
And I said, what if we do it Marvel style? What if you've worked with Rick and I for years now. What if you just come up with characters and storylines? We pencil them, we fax them to you, you dialogue them. That way you don't have to sit down at a typewriter at any point in time that you don't want to, right? You can call us on the phone, brainstorm the way we love to anyway. We were all adept at that and had done it together as a threesome even. Let's just do it that way. And that sounded enticing to Alan. He thought that was viable, and he knew that Rick and I would do the hard work of, the penciling and so on. He knew our work. He knew we could do it.
The question was posed to Alan Moore in Inside Image about why he was returning to superheroes after his farewell to the genre. Alan Moore responded, besides the fact that Steve Bissette called and asked me, it's a number of things, not the least of which is the financial considerations. The subjects I was exploring in projects like Big Numbers, Lost Girls, and From Hell, Jack the Ripper, Alice in Wonderland in Austria during 1913, they are probably not the most commercial ideas I've ever had in my life. Although my aesthetics are different than theirs, I admire what the people at Image are doing. They've shaken up the industry in a very brutal way. But when they approached me through Steve, I didn't know whether I had any interest at all in doing superheroes again. I simply wouldn't do a superhero book again unless there was something in there I could find interesting. Because even though I said money was a consideration, I have never done anything for money. If I couldn't find a way to enjoy the project, then I wouldn't do it. This presented a problem, in that after Watchmen and Miracle Man, I had become pretty thoroughly sick of the postmodern superheroes that seemed to me that postmodern comics were like viewing a distorted mirror at a fun fair where you go in and see these grotesque-looking things and you think, my God, that's me. That was the feeling I got reading some of these comics. I could see stylistic elements that had been taken from my own work and used mainly as an excuse for more prurient sex and more graphic violence. Now, everywhere I turn, there are these psychotic vigilantes dealing out death mercilessly with none of the irony that I had hoped I brought to my characters. So I felt a bit depressed in that it seemed I had unknowingly ushered in a new dark age of comic books.
Why did this story offend me so much?
There was none of the delight, freshness, and charm that I remembered of the comics from my own youth. It struck me as a terrible shame.
But after thinking about it for a while,
when I returned to them, I felt that I'd probably prefer that superheroes have all of the energy that I remember from the comics of my youth, sort of less of that misery that Watchmen, in part, had brought to them. So yeah, that was probably part of the decision to have some fun with an older style of comics in 1963. 1963 has been a great deal of fun. It's given me a great burst of energy that has been very refreshing in the midst of more demanding projects. It's a bit like customarily working in a symphony orchestra but playing in a bubblegum band on weekends. And it's plugged me back into some of the reasons why I became involved in comics in the first place.
So the bigger learning curve, though, was working with Image.
And Jim Lee had seized control of the annual It was supposed to be 6 issues, concluding with a giant annual in the form of the old Silver Age Batman, Superman, Jimmy Olsen, Lois Lane annuals. And Jim Lee seized control of that with Rick's and my and Alan's permission early on. It was this whole crazy scene at the San Diego Con in 1992.
We were down on the floor, and Don Simpson came down and said, "Hey, you got to come up here. The Image guys want to talk to you." So we followed him up to the biggest hall. It holds like 5,000 people, and it's full of Image fans. And the Image guys are holding court up there. Todd McFarlane, he's got the mic and he's doing his thing on stage. And the pitch was that they wanted to announce it on stage, that moment, but that we had to agree to Jim Lee taking over the annual, which would have been the ultimate ending of 1963. And we were kind of stuck because we couldn't get a hold of Alan from San Diego. There was no way to say. We had to make that decision ourselves. And I think I was more open to it than Steve was.
My perception, I'm not saying this is what happened, but my perception is Jim Lee wanted to show up, Jim Valentino, at the announcement at that San Diego Con.
But ultimately, Jim came down, Jim Valentino came down, we talked it all out. Jim Lee said he really wanted to do this and that he would. I'm not sure if he could have stopped the project. I don't know if it had to have his vote to even happen. That's a good question for Valentino.
What bothered me was that they wanted Jim to take over the annual and pulled it away from me. That bothered me because it just seemed like a slap in the face, which I think it was.
But we agreed to it, and they announced it.
When Jim Valentino got up and announced that he was working on a brand new project with Alan Moore and Rick Veitch and Steve Bissette, and Rick and Steve are in the audience, and this Image crowd goes nuts, and Jim Lee grabbed the microphone and said, "And I'm doing the annual."
They brought us up on stage. Todd and Rob and these guys were like throwing hats and stuff down to the crowd. And so as they were throwing this merch out to the fans, rushed the stage. And we had to be pulled out by security. It was like being a rock star or something.
I wasn't around personally at that time.
After this bizarre day of phone calls to Alan and Rick and I on the floor of the convention, and Alan in England as Jim Lee's jockeying to take over the annual, and then he didn't do anything. He never did a single thing. And we didn't realize till after the fact that it had nothing to do with us. It just had to do with the pissing contests that were going on between the individual players at Image, Todd McFarlane, Jim Lee, Jim Valentino. And so we put together the deal that was 1963 after a series of conversations with Jim Valentino, where Jim Valentino said, right, here's the Image deal. And remember, this is when Image was only a year old. You guys do the work. There's no money up front, but you get 80% of the back end. Whatever the book earns, you guys get 80%. And you tell us how you want it split up between you. Rick and I were pragmatic enough that we knew, well, we got to get some kind of a page rate, even if it's a nominal page rate. And then we negotiated with Jim Valentino a nominal page rate, so that a little bit of money, and I'm talking about like $50 a page, not much more than that, would be paid for every pencil page and finished script page. So there was a little bit of money coming in for Alan, a little bit of money justifying Rick Veitch and I getting together. And Rick went the extra mile. Rick said, okay, Bissette, I know your shitty work habits. He had a friend who had a cabin, a 2-room cabin, that was geographically almost exactly between where I lived and where Rick lived. And we would meet there 5 days a week and pencil. That would be our work studio. And that's how we got the project done. Alan would phone us up, and we would brainstorm stories, or Alan would call up with a complete story. We would use fax machines between us. There was no internet at this time. to design the characters and so on. And it was a pretty free-form process.
He did write scripts, but he often phoned them in first because we were running so late. So I'd get him on the phone, and I'd be roughing out the panels to his descriptions. But then, he would finish typing it up and then mail it in. And they were much simpler descriptions that we were getting. But then they would have all the dialogue in them as well. And I'd see if there's anything I had missed or that I had misunderstood on the phone. But the whole scheduling of it was so tight that he often had to phone in the stuff.
In the Jack Kirby Collector, Alan Moore reminisced about the 1963 series. Partly, that was a matter of expediency. We needed to be able to do these things quite fast, without a huge amount of extra typing work for me. Also, it was appropriate that we did them in a Marvel style. I'd lay out a page with, say, 6 panels in it. I did 2 or 3 pages like that. I phoned them through to Rick Veitch or Steve Bissette. So what we did was, I'd read them the panel descriptions over the phone, like there's somebody in the left foreground, or there's somebody in the right background. We're in this kind of setting. These are who the characters are. This is kind of roughly what they're saying to each other. One of them looks angry. The other one looks impassive. Then I go through that bit, and they send the artwork. Probably before I'd even seen the artwork, I'd touch up the dialogue and send that over to them. So I'd get the dialogue done, and they'd have to work from that, because I'd already know what was going to be in the panel, because I'd described each panel rather than just give a plot breakdown to the page. So it was a bit more of a shorthand version than the way I usually write. It wasn't quite the Marvel method. I was kind of writing it faster as well. That was to try and get that thrill, that rush of creativity that I'm sure must have been a part of working on those early Marvel comics back then.
And out of that, I ended up doing 3 stories, 3 characters, the Fury, Endman, and the Hypernaut. And Rick ended up doing much more than that because he was better with deadlines, quicker on the draw. And at a certain point in time, the Fury was supposed to be the first issue, but Alan decided Mystery Incorporated should be first and called me up and said, is it okay if Mystery Incorporated goes first? Now, bear in mind, I'll put my business hat on. I knew the minute I said yes, I was losing money, right? Because issue number 1s always sell better.
Sure.
But I didn't care. Rick and Alan were partners, and if that's how it had to go, that's the way it was going to go. And we also reached out to other people we had either worked with or wanted to work with. So we invited Dave Gibbons in, John Totleben, Don Simpson, and I reached out to Chester Brown because I love Chester's work, and I had met Chester at a couple of events up in Canada. And I thought, wouldn't it be fun to pencil something Chester Brown inked? And Chester was up for it.
Yeah. Well, they were all our friends, and we wanted to take care of them all. We saw that we were going to make some money, and we wanted to bring our friends in because we knew that if they had capital, they would do what they really wanted to do, the kind of comics they really wanted to do, and that would be good for our art form.
And I just had a bit of a windfall. I'd done some inking for Image Comics, way back when they started and with like $1 million comic books.
Dave Gibbons would just save the day with Tomorrow Syndicate because it was running so late, and by then Steve had left the project, and he inked it and lettered it in record time, and we just got it in on the wire. Just thank you, Dave Gibbons, wherever you are.
But then we started hitting speed bumps. Like Rick and I were doing all the editing, but we weren't paying ourselves for editors. Like we didn't take a share as editors. We just earned the same as everybody else based on how many pages we had done in that issue. And this wasn't greed kicking in. This became problematic when we weren't paying ourselves for the pinups in the issues that we'd drawn, but somebody who had drawn a pinup was expecting that fat check. And so things did get fraught on that end of things.
We weren't used to having to do our own marketing, solicitation, and production, Steve and I. So we were constantly being hit with, hey, we got to have this by tomorrow. We got to have this by tomorrow. We got to have this by the next day. And it was like every day there'd be something that Image needed from us. And we were on this constant treadmill of learning how to do it, getting it done, and then getting it to them. And this put incredible pressure on Steve and I. We were like pulling all-nighters, just all the time. It was crazy.
So we ended up doing 63, and it didn't, the way it turned out, we ended up with 6 issues that were just what we were picturing. But at a certain point in time, there was a reliance on a second Image partner, Jim Lee. And in fact, he declared he was taking a sabbatical right at the time we needed him. And the whole thing kind of like fell apart at the end. And in a nutshell, that's what happened. That's my perception of what happened anyway.
I think this is another thing that I think is our fault. Steve and I thought Jim Valentino was dealing with Jim Lee. Jim Valentino thought Steve and I were dealing with Jim Lee. So Jim Lee didn't hear from us all during this. But we weren't in touch with him, calling him up and telling him how things were going and making sure he was on board, because we thought Valentino was doing it. Valentino thought we were doing it. By the time the script comes out, he had decided to take a sabbatical from doing comics. And so
I was the first of the partners as this was falling apart. It was getting harder and harder to get Alan on the phone. He was having his own trials and tribulations in England that I was not aware of at the time, because no one said anything to me about it, including Alan.
At the same time, Alan, uncharacteristically, was harder and harder to get a hold of. Like usually we could call him up and get a hold of him. He's there and we could solve problems if we had questions and stuff like that, but he wasn't around. And he would like disappear for a week, 2 weeks at a time. And then when we did get a hold of him, we'd have this laundry list of stuff we needed. So that created tension among us as well. I did, we didn't know it at the time. Later, he shared with me that he had been going through a kind of personal crisis that he couldn't share with us at the time. I don't know if I can really discuss it. He shared with me what was going on. I would say that I read an interview with him not long ago where he talked about that time when he was first getting into magic. Mm-hmm. And he was exploring magic using psychedelics, and that he had a mini nervous breakdown. I think that's the way he described it. Okay. So I think he was in turmoil, but he wasn't able to tell us that. So we just didn't know what was going on.
And we couldn't get Jim Lee to respond to anything. I still have the one fax he sent us with this beautiful drawing of one of the characters from Mystery Incorporated, and then nothing. We could not get him or anyone in his studio on the phone. And I contacted Rick and Alan, and I said, look, I'll pencil my part of the annual, but I can't edit or co-edit a project where I can't get the two principal players, Jim Lee and Alan Moore, to talk. Alan actually scripted the beginning of the annual. There were a number of pages scripted, not a majority of pages, but there were, 10 or 15 pages of script that we did have.
And I've got the script for the double image 80-page giant annual here, the first 11 pages. He starts out with this incredibly dense description of the Mystery Incorporated dropping out of hyperspace into modern image New York that I could, it's like 2 pages for the first panel.
We just couldn't get anyone to move. The best analogy I can give you is what Larry Marder said to me at the time, because I was heartbroken at it. And Rick took it really hard, and I can't blame him. He felt like I was, bailing out of the project.
What happened was Steve and I were under unbelievable pressure to get these books out on time, and we were doing it. But like I say, every day was just an incredible struggle. And Steve cracked first. We were just finishing. I was just finishing putting the production for book 5 together, Horace. And out of the blue, Steve sent us a fax, basically resigning from the project. And I'd been talking to him every day, and I had no idea this was coming at me. Alan didn't either. I remember we got on the phone afterwards, and we just couldn't understand like what he was doing. But tried to get a hold of him. He wouldn't pick up the phone. I probably should have tried harder. I should have driven over to his house and tried to talk sense to him, but I was exhausted, and I was kind of mad at him because he had dumped the last book in my lap. We had been taking turns running the production, and he was supposed to be production guy on the 6th book. And by walking away, that meant there was only one person left to do it. So that was a pretty crazy month, I'll tell you.
Yeah, Image didn't know what to make of it.
Sure.
I mean, Image is a publisher. You were asking, the whole beginning of this conversation was you wanted me to compare publishers. Image is a publisher. They didn't know what to make of what we were doing. When I think of the entity that was Image at that time, Jim Valentino totally understood what we were doing with 1963. He got it, and it was in his wheelhouse, and it was in his, realm of the comics he'd grown up with.
Alan called me up, and he said in his very thick English accent, "What would Dr. Strange look like if he was Jack Kerouac?" And I said, "He'd look like Jaime Hernandez." And Alan dropped the phone laughing and goes, "Yeah, that's it." So that's how we created Johnny Beyond.
But he's as much a part of this as we were. He was just fantastic.
The other Image guys didn't get it. Like, it's on newsprint. Why aren't they using this shitty coloring process, right? Whereas we had spared no expense in tracking down and working with Murphy Anderson and his son, Murphy Anderson Jr. They did all the production on the color and the color sets. And part of why we worked with Murphy and Murphy is the older Murphy Anderson had drawn those Silver Age DC comics like Hawkman and the Spectre and so on. And the older Murphy would tell us when we turned in Anthony Tolan's color guides, or we had a couple of different people who did color guides. Murphy could tell us, yeah, they had that color, or no, they wouldn't have used that color, they would have used this color, right?
Yeah, because we had to relearn a lot of stuff. And also, essentially, we had to find a printing press that could print the thing. Mm-hmm. Like, you can't get pulp printed comics anymore. That's gone.
So, I mean, it was spot on, as close as we could get in 1993 to what a Silver Age comic from 1963 actually looked and felt like. And the only guys at Image that got it were, as far as we could tell, were Jim Valentino and Larry Marder.
We call up Alan. I said, "Alan, you're on speakerphone because I got Eric Stevenson here." And Alan goes, "Oh, Eric, nice to see you with a reputable Image partner."
Wow.
Yeah.
And when the sales figures came in for the first book, Mystery Incorporated, for us, it was the most comics we had ever sold in our lives, guys. Like, it was amazing. It was like 500,000 copies of Mystery Incorporated #1. And to the Image guys, that's peanuts. To Todd and Jim and Rob Liefeld, they were just like, they were looking for $1 million to $2 million, So we were like shit on their shoe. There was never an ad for the 1963 line. I remember brainstorming on the phone. Larry Marder was trying to work up an ad campaign, and we came up with the idea of photos, instead of using the covers, having photos of kids with our comic book rolled up in their back pocket riding a Schwinn bicycle from 1963. And Larry had come up with this great plan for it, and it all got deep six because the Image guys just, why throw good money after bad? Like, these just aren't selling enough. And every issue, we watched it with the sales. Every single issue lost 100,000 in sales.
I'm sure
it was the most I ever earned in my life, all my life combined. Okay.
Incredible.
And being able, and we shared equal partners with everybody that was part of the book. So, being able to cut a check to Chester Brown that was more than he'd ever seen for his inking the Hypernaut story, was very gratifying. But everybody earned very, very well off of that. Yeah, it was amazing. And it was amazing to be someone who had worked in comics by that time for over 15 years. And we're seeing this kind of payday, but we're hearing on the phone, it's not enough.
It's incredible.
And the other problem, which I'll state in just 2 sentences, was as follows. Image didn't want us, or 1963. Image wanted Alan Moore. And what happened was, as soon as Jim Valentino got the 1963 project up and going, all the other partners called Alan and pulled him in to work on their books. So we lost Alan's time and energy as that got poured into Spawn books with Todd and, Supreme with Rob and what have you.
It did with Steve. I wasn't bothered by it. I thought, if Alan can get an offer to draw an issue of Spawn and make $500,000, God bless it. And I knew him well enough and know him well enough to know that he wouldn't let us down. He would finish the project with us as described. He wouldn't just let it dangle. Steve had been working with Alan for a couple of years on From Hell and Taboo. And so I think there was some tension there. Steve trying to edit and organize Alan to get scripts to Eddie to finish From Hell so that could be in Taboo. That was a tension thing. So, Steve kind of, I think, was bringing some of that baggage to it. But he was pretty unhappy with it. And I think in a later interview, he saw it as abandonment of us, but I don't see that at all. It was just, he had an opportunity to bang out a script and make a bunch of money. I would have done it.
They got the book they wanted, 1963, Alan Moore working with 2 of his buddies, Rick Veitch, Steve Bissette, and then we bring in the other buddies, Dave Gibbons, John Totleben, Don Simpson, but the Image partners want Alan working with them on their books, and that meant that as we got each issue of 63 done, it was getting harder and harder and harder to get the Image partners and our own partner to stay engaged with finishing the project. Like, we had a finish line. Let's just get to that finish line. And we couldn't get to that finish line.
We never got to finish that series for various reasons, which was a shame, and also because events kind of superseded it. But I think pretty much that would have been the conclusion. To put the 2 superheroes in contrast together. But I guess just the fact that 1963 was appearing on the stands at the same time as did those heroes kind of made the contrast implicitly anyway. So yeah, I guess in a way we did, but not as thoroughly as we originally intended.
He said yes. He's going to write Violator for you? Oh, yeah, bud, Alan's chomping at the bit. And you're like, chomping at the bit to do the Violator? Like, what the hell? What part of the Twilight Zone did I wake up in, right? Okay.
Todd asked me originally if I'd like to work with him again doing this 3-issue Violator series. And I said yes, because I enjoyed working with Todd.
Well, so anyway, I initiate Eric Stevenson to contact him and offer him Violator Badrock, because what's better? And Alan's like, I'm just so glad my phone is ringing. And you're like, what the hell happened? Where did we go wrong? Why is, like, I felt bad, like Violator Bad, but he wanted to do it.
As with much of the stuff I've done for Image, it's been a great deal of fun because it is such a romp. It's very easy, and I can do things that are just purely there for fun. They don't have to have a great deal of relevance to the state of the world, the collapse of Eastern Europe, the angst of modern man, or any of those other broad and weighty yet worthy social concerns. They can just be about a bunch of demons ripping each other's innards out, and I've had as much fun with that as I can.
So Alan Moore is getting big bucks to do Violator Badrock for us. We're paying him a lot of money. So he's super happy. And so what I think he does is, hey, you guys got that Supreme character. He lobbies us. I've been looking at some of these books. Why don't you give me a shot at Supreme? Hell yes. You don't have to ask me twice. Like, you got to be kidding me, right?
Rob said that he wanted to revamp Supreme, and would I call up Alan and ask him to take over Supreme? Okay. He goes, but I don't want any of that 1963 shit. And I was like, Rob, if you're going to ask him to take over Supreme, you're going to take whatever he gives you. Okay? And Alan was in this sort of nostalgic binge after 1963, which he later brought to America's Best Comics, right? So I figured out and Dave Gibbons told me once that this was the absolute perfect thing to say to Alan. So I call up Alan. Eric Stevenson is there with me. That's why it came to mind. And I figured the best thing I could say to Alan, we want you to take over writing Supreme. He goes, oh, I don't know. I go, Alan, I'm going to give you, think about it for a couple of days. I'm going to give you a call back in a couple of days, but think about this. We want you to do everything with Supreme that DC wouldn't let you do with Superman. That was it. That's what got him on board.
Can't blame Alan, but it was one of the things pulling at him. And the other thing, and I've seen this enough times in comics, you've got a hungry creator working on a project out of love and because they need the income. And when another check comes in from another project, bingo, their attention goes there. So, we couldn't compete. We weren't looking to compete with Todd McFarlane, but that's what ended up happening. Once the payday came in on those Todd McFarlane Spawn issues with Alan writing one that Todd drew, and then Dave Sim and Frank Miller, those were bigger payday checks than any of those individuals had ever seen in comics in their lives. And how are you going to keep them down on the farm?
Well, the biggest problem, I think, is the partnership of Rick, Steve, and Alan. I think if we'd been able to hold our partnership together as friends, then we would have come up with a solution and we would have had the annual of some sort. And I bet you we would have also had more 63 comics following it. But we couldn't hold it together, the three of us. And so if there's blame, it's Rick, Alan, and Steve who just weren't able to hold their thing together.